Good afternoon. I'm Robert Lieberman of Johns Hopkins University, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the second installment of our series, Democracy in the Balance. These webinars are co-sponsored by the American Academy of Political and Social Science, the Einaudi Center for International Studies at Cornell University, and the American Democracy Collaborative, which is a scholarly initiative dedicated to examining the state of American democracy through historical and comparative analysis. We present these webinars in conjunction with the publication of a new special issue of the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science on democratic vulnerabilities, which is just out and available online as of yesterday. In our first webinar last month, we explored the theme of democratic vulnerability and resilience in the United States just over a year after the shocking events of January 6th, 2021. Now we turn our attention beyond American shores to consider how the United States fits into a world where democracy is increasingly under threat. Today's topic is Democracies at Risk, a Global Perspective. Even a quick glance at the headlines tells us the United States is not the only country where democracy is vulnerable. The forces of polarization, populism, and autocracy have provoked deep conflict and democratic backsliding across the globe in recent years. Countries such as Venezuela, Turkey, Hungary, and perhaps most pertinently today, Russia, that once seemed to be on the road to democratization have reversed course with often tragic and devastating consequences, such as the destructive invasion of the Ukraine that has the democratic world gripped in horror. How does the United States fit into this global pattern? What lessons does a global perspective hold for the challenges of democratic vulnerability in the United States? And what have been the most effective sources of resilience in the global struggle for democracy? To help us dive into these questions, we have a wonderful group of panelists joining us today. Jennifer Mccoy is Distinguished University Professor of Political Science at Georgia State University and a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She's published widely on the challenges facing polarized democracies today, and especially on the causes and consequences of what she calls pernicious polarization, about which I'm sure you'll hear this afternoon. Jennifer is also a research affiliate of the Democracy Institute of the Central European University, and somewhat appropriately, she joins us today from Budapest. Kas Muda is a professor of political science at the University of Georgia. He's a leading observer and commentator on challenges to liberal democracy around the world. His numerous books include Populist Radical Right Parties in Europe, The Far Right Today, and Populism, a very short introduction, which has been translated into more than 20 languages. And Ken Roberts is a professor of government at Cornell University. He's the author of numerous books and articles on parties, social movements, and populism, primarily in Latin America, in books such as the award-winning Changing Course in Latin America, Party Systems in the Neoliberal Era. More recently, as a co-convener of the American Democracy Collaborative, Ken has also turned his attention to democratic vulnerability in the United States. We're also extremely lucky to have Zach Beecham as the moderator of today's discussion. Zach is a senior correspondent at Vox, where he covers politics and ideology, and where he's written sensitively and insightfully about many of the issues before us today. If you've been reading Vox in the last few weeks, and if you haven't, you should be, you'll know that Zach has been deeply involved in their coverage of Ukraine, so we're especially grateful that he's taken a few minutes out of his day job to join us today. So here's how things will go. Zach will lead a discussion among our panelists for about 40 minutes, and then they'll turn to questions from you, the audience. So please, at any time, submit your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And we'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can. And with that, I'll turn things over to Zach.
Hey, Rob, thanks for that really wonderful introduction. And I appreciate you focusing on the Ukraine issue because it's most of what I've been thinking about for the past 3 weeks, but it's also not disconnected from the main topics that we're talking about here today. So much of the world's response has focused on the question of democracy, and is this a fight for democracy? Are we seeing divides between the democratic world and the autocratic world emerging into two separate blocks? And now a lot of that gets discussed at the level of politics between states, but there are also some really important intrastate politics issues that are at work here. You've got countries with significant internal threats to democracy, like Hungary, like the United States, like India, playing notable roles one way or the other in the response to Ukraine's the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I guess I want to start, given that this topic's on everyone's minds, with all three of you, if I could ask you to bring your expertise to bear on the question of how democratic backsliding in advanced democracies and the rise of anti-democratic political movements is affecting the world's response to Russia's invasion. And you can go ahead and talk about whatever angle of that you're interested in whatever order.
Well, okay, I'll start. I think that for the US, it is not affecting it as much as we thought so far, our democratic erosion. And we've had a remarkable, I think, rally around the flag effect, a uniting that we haven't seen for quite some time, behind the US response, behind NATO, and behind Ukraine. And I think that's really welcome. It'll be interesting to see how long it lasts. With our deep polarization, one of the things we usually think of theoretically is that an external threat should unite us, overcome polarization. And we thought that would happen at the pandemic, but it happened for about a month, maybe 2 months. And then it became politicized and polarized again. So I'm hoping that this one won't be that way. Now, if we look at other countries, though, around the world, and I'm sitting right now in Budapest, Hungary, one of the ones mentioned, we see that the really backsliding or more authoritarian countries are threading the needle between particularly Hungary, Turkey, being in NATO, and Hungary being in the EU, Poland as well in the EU, and their ties and really dependence on Russia. So ties to Putin, personal ties among leaders. And when we can expand out to Brazil with Bolsonaro or India and others, then we see this really, they're trying to thread the needle. So between their geopolitical interest or their actual dependence. So for Hungary, they're over 80% of their energy comes from Russia. So real dependence. And their ties for the NATO and EU countries, their ties to NATO. So we really see that. I think the one exception there is Poland is also a democratic backslider, but has been strongly against Putin. And I think that derives from their historic kind of hatred of and resentment against Russian and Soviet intervention in their country. And so that's overcoming any possible, affinity toward other strongmen.
I just can build off on that. I fully agree with that. I mean, the Polish case is also a very personal case. The twin brother of the real important person in Poland, Kaczynski, was killed in a plane crash in Russia, and he's convinced that the Russians were behind it, Putin was behind it, and so this feeds it even more. But I think the most important thing is that there are no clear illiberal versus liberal blocks, and this is one of the big problems that we've always had. We've always had democratic alliances or alliances that allegedly fight for liberal democracy that had illiberal actors in it. Think about Franco's Spain in NATO. And we have that again, and we had that in Biden's initiative for democracy, which included Poland, which included India. And what you now see is that on the one hand, probably the strongest anti-Russian response and push at the moment within the EU comes from an illiberal democratic regime, which is Poland. And the strongest push against it, or I wouldn't say the strongest push against it, because that probably comes actually from within Italy and Germany and the Netherlands. But the most undermining of it comes from Hungary. Right? Hungary has, as it so often has in foreign policy, an international discourse where it does what the EU does, and it says that it supports it. And then it has a domestic discourse in Hungarian that no one understands, where he pretty much just says exactly what he has said before. Pretty much yesterday, he said that Hungary should remain neutral in this conflict, right? Now, what I find most interesting is like, what is this support about? And so for a very long time, you have this whole discourse about the far right being Russia's puppets, Putin's puppets. I think what you see today is that it has much less to do with ideology. Yes, sure, they share an enemy, the liberal global order. It has much more to do with financial connections, be that either the country or the kleptocracy. Like again, if you take Orban, Hungary has significant economic interest in Russia and in China, but Orban and his kleptocracy around it has phenomenal personal financial ties to it as well. And so I think a lot of these things, the ties, like Matteo Salvini, the far right leader in Italy, who just did a complete about face. What that shows is that it was always a kind of an opportunistic embrace of Putin. And the only ones that really stand by him or try to defend it are the ones who just have phenomenal economic financial interest at stake.
Thanks. I'll just say a few words and try to build a little bit upon what Cass was just saying, because I agree with both what Cass and Jennifer has said in terms of their analysis of these cases. And it seems to me that for countries like Hungary, Turkey, Poland, you get different kinds of interests that are at play and oftentimes not aligning together. So there may be economic interests, there may be certain ideological affinities. There are also national, strategic, political kinds of interests. And I think what you see is that countries like Hungary or Poland at one time that may have a certain vested interest in having Russia as a kind of counterweight to Western and US influence. And so they like to have Russia there as a counterweight, but that's assuming that Russia is going to stay within their borders and that Putin is not going to try to reestablish the Russian imperium. And a reassertion of the Russian imperium can be quite a threat to Hungary, to Poland, to Turkey, and other places. And so I think a lot of countries do not anticipate, very few people anticipated Putin really doing what he's done. And so I think there's a certain scrambling of some of the alignments that were there beforehand. Poland certainly has taken a very strong stand, as Jennifer and Cass have pointed out. Hungary under Orban trying to thread the needle, as Jennifer was saying. India, in some ways, following a similar kind of line, trying to remain neutral and thread the needle. So I think that this has scrambled things in a lot of ways. The case would be very interesting to think about. Were Trump still the president of the United States, it is very hard to imagine the United States adopting the kind of staunch anti-Putin line that we have been taking and then trying to lead a Western alliance of aligning against Russia. And just given the kinds of positions that Trump took vis-a-vis Putin and also vis-a-vis the Western alliance, you would imagine that a different kind of US leadership might have dealt with this crisis quite differently, but that's a counterfactual. We can't know how it would have played out.
So I don't want to probe that counterfactual exactly, but it does, in conjunction with something Jennifer said, raise, I think, a really interesting question about how we evaluate democratic backsliding in the United States right now. Because, there's a certain lens that you can look at it and say, okay, the Democrats have a trifecta, right? The Republicans, which are the party that most scholars ascribe or blame for democratic backsliding, certainly during the Trump administration, are out of power and relatively impotent at the national level right now, though at the subnational level, they have significant force and look likely to win the midterm elections. But even then, right, if you look at what Republicans have done, the redistricting process was much less tilted in their favor. They were much less aggressive than some expected. Courts have ruled against some of their maps, and Democrats have been much more effective. And the result is a much more competitive map in congressional elections than most analysts were projecting. I'm sort of steelmanning a case that I'm not sure I believe here, but I'm curious to get your thoughts on. And to what extent has the process of democratic backsliding been arrested as the result of Biden's victory and the Democratic victories more broadly in 2020? And to what extent are the key processes driving it still underway?
maybe I can respond first in part because Jennifer is in a different type of competitive authoritarianism. But I think that this account of how the US is at the moment depends a lot where you live. I don't recognize that at all living in Georgia. One of the big problems of the US is actually, it is a very strong federal state, which means that the Republicans might be out of power at the federal level, but they're not out of power at many state levels. And state levels have phenomenal power as well as potential to impact the federal elections because they organize them, right? And so when I look at the last couple of years, yes, in a very narrow sense, the process of democratic erosion has been arrested, has been like halted at the federal level. I think at the state level, it has gone in overdrive. And the fact that it has not been as bad as it could have been is in itself already like a kind of a way that we deal with drama and trauma, is that we just like adopt to it. But I mean, being a non-American living in the US, what happens here and what the Republican Party does in a state like Georgia is completely unthinkable in a European context. Like the open discourse that is openly anti-democratic, the undermining of the possibility of people to vote, like these type of things, that I don't know any party that calls for that. Like I know some who do it perhaps, or have tried to do it. So I think it depends a lot on where you are. And of course, if the Republicans come back, and we can safely say when they come back, that it will be 2022, but also 2024, they have done phenomenal legwork at the state level, and all the laws are in place to do it at the federal level. So, I mean, I personally am far more skeptical, negative, pessimistic about the future than I was in the last year under Trump.
Yes, I want to follow up on that, not only because I agree with the thrust of what you were saying. I, in fact, had a very long debate with the New York Times' Ross Douthat about that on Vox Conversations, our podcast, if you want to listen to it, where I took basically your position. Not only do I think it's right, but I think you raised something really important that I wanted to talk about, which is the comparison to European radical right factions in the behavior of the Republican Party. You know, that there's a survey of academic political scientists that placed sort of on an ideological spectrum relative to hostility to democracy and minority rights, the Republican Party at the very extreme end, right, along with Erdogan's AKP, right, like that's where we were talking about in terms of extreme hostility to democratic practices. It seemed that most radical right parties in Europe, on this survey in particular, and sort of in my experience covering them in general, don't have the same level of open antagonism towards democracy that you see in, especially at the state level in certain Republican-controlled legislatures. Obviously, there are exceptions. Hungary is the clearest one, I think. But on the whole, it seems that it's not obvious to me that anti-democracy is a core value of radical right parties. It seems that there's some internal heterogeneity or variation between them, and with the GOP actually at the extreme end, even when compared to something like National Rally in France. Am I right here, Cass, or is this a little too friendly to those parties?
No, I think you are right. I mean, the literature, and I make a distinction between extreme right and radical right, where the extreme right is anti-democracy per se, populist sovereignty and majority rule, simply stated they don't want the people to elect their own leaders. Whereas the radical right accepts that minimum kind of interpretation of democracy, but has mostly problems with liberal protections like minority rights, separation of power, rule of law. Now, of course, we're not back in the 1930s, right? In the 1930s, people, Hitler and Mussolini, were openly and proudly anti-democratic. And they argued that like democracy was the system of mediocrity, etc. Today, we have parties that claim to save democracy, to be the real Democrats while undermining democracy. And that makes everything very tricky. But I fully agree with the way that the Republican Party came out in that specific study. And I'm very annoyed as well as disturbed by the fact that, first of all, there's still a lot of media as well as colleagues in political science who reference the Republican Party as a conservative party. But even radical right, I think, is like that's borderline radical right. For what they do, they are extreme right. They're anti-democratic, and that there are very few parties that are like that. And one of the most important one is Fidesz, which also has a nominally democratic discourse, right? Allegedly also saves democracy from the Soros-controlled opposition, but has now also pretty much undermined democracy to such a way that you could argue it's no longer competitive. But I would say even in that respect, it hasn't been as brazen in terms of denying access to voting as the Republican Party has been in the states that it controls.
Jen, this is a good time for me to pivot to you, given that you're in Hungary right now and have some comparative expertise that you can bring to bear here. First, audience, I want to remind you all, please post questions in the Q&A. We're really excited to answer your thoughts, and we're really interested in what you have to say. So let us know, write them down. We'll get to them at the end. So Jennifer, here's what I wanted to ask you. First, Cass just said that Hungary might not be a competitive authoritarian state anymore. Is that your sense on the ground right now? And sort of second, to connect this to the US question, when you study what you call pernicious polarization, right? The US came out with this astonishingly high score, like a democracy threatening, scary score on the level of polarization it had. The historical antecedents that you found in your research were France in 1968, in the midst of the May uprising, and Italy during the years of lead in the 1970s. Like, that's a wild set of historical comparisons. We're talking actual bloodshed and conflict in the streets of the city. So tell me, is the US even worse off than some of its current developed world peers, right? How bad are things when you generalize from your research?
Well, first on Hungary, yeah, I would call it, well, Orban himself, the leader, calls it an illiberal democracy. And so he says majoritarian rule is fine, but the liberal part of protecting, rights and having checks and balances shouldn't be there. And what he has done, though, is similar to what most populists try to do, and which is increasing the concentration of power in the governing party, which is to entrench their rule by making elections more and more unlevel, tainted, sometimes manipulated, but making them unfair, or the disproportionate representation, so that they will entrench their majorities and their supermajorities and be able to change the constitutions to control other institutions. And so in Hungary, the media, the state media, Cass was talking before about what is the rhetoric about the Ukraine war. The state media is giving Russian propaganda. And that's what most people see in Hungary. Independent media is few and far between. While for Western media, for international media, Orban is saying he's going along with NATO, with the EU sanctions, et cetera. So the control of the media, control of academics of universities, control of many entities is there. All right, bringing in the US, the kind of level that I'm talking about, pernicious polarization, is when a society is so divided into two mutually distrustful camps that they actually begin to see each other as an existential threat. And that's what can lead both political parties, leaders, and voters to support democratic erosion. That is, to support anti-democratic moves because they're so afraid of the other camp being in power that they've got to keep them out, or they've got to keep themselves in. And so that's what I see is happening in the United States. And just to give you one statistic about that, the Pew Research Center asks a question on their surveys for the last 30 years, to what extent, Democrats, do you see the Republicans or their policies as a threat to the nation or as a harm to the nation, and vice versa? In the 1990s, Democrats and Republicans saw each other as a threat. Only at the rate of 25% of the population said yes. By 2016, that was up to 45% mutually, both sides even. Now, 2021, it got up to 90% of the population of voters answering this, saying that they saw the other side as a threat. That is really scary for the United States. And I think that's what we've got to, to try to overcome. And that's what is supporting this kind of anti-democratic, or the fear that the kinds of things that Cass was talking about at the state level. So perhaps we'll get back to talking about the role of the institutions in the United States. But our research found that the US is the only advanced kind of Western full liberal democracy with this level of sustained high pernicious polarization today. The others that are at that level are lesser democracies, less wealthy and less advanced, less fully developed, or electoral autocracies, that is competitive authoritarians that have this level. So that's why it's so frightening to me.
So Ken, let's turn to you now, because there's a lot in your research, I think, that can help shed light on these questions. You spent a lot of time studying Latin America, and I think a lot of this conversation about democratic backsliding focuses on Europe. I think not wrongly. There are a lot of parallels to the US there, but there are also a lot of notable and important connections between the US and our American peers. One of them, I think, is particularly notable, is a presidential system, or at least the predominance of presidential systems. So I guess I want to ask you another kind of two-part question, right? The first one is, when you look at Latin American democracies, what's the translation from high levels of polarization, which have happened there with some frequency, to democratic erosion? What's the causal mechanism that links those two things together? And second, we've been talking mostly about the right here, but the left is perhaps not of equal importance in the US case, but that in and of itself is interesting, right? Because in Latin America, you've had plenty of left-wing authoritarian governments in addition to the right-wing ones. Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, and increasingly it looks like AMLO in Mexico is governing along a more populist authoritarian model. So what is it about the Democratic Party that makes it not like those parties? And why really does it seem like in the US we're getting more turned towards anti-democratic practice on the right rather than the left?
Well, it's a good question. Let me start by talking about the relationship between polarization and democratic erosion in Latin America, because we have seen places, Venezuela in particular, where there was a sharp ideological polarization, and also a polarization not just around ideology, which is something that Latin America has seen in the past. And in some ways, I would argue that ideologically, Latin America is much less polarized today than it was in the 1960s and 1970s, where you had revolutionary movements on the left that had a very different model of change, and where there were real debates between socialism and capitalism. And that wasn't only where you had a revolutionary left. A country like Chile, where you had a democratic left operating within a democratic regime, but they really believed in bringing about socialism. And so you want to talk about polarization under democracy, along with the cases that Jennifer was talking about. The Chilean case would be an extreme case. Today, we don't really have those kinds of dramatic ideological debates between revolution and democracy, or between capitalism and socialism. There's debates about what kind of capitalism, how much social reform, how much redistribution, but in some ways it's a less polarized ideological debate than what was there before. Where there is polarization, though, and where I think Jennifer's work on pernicious polarization is very helpful in trying to understand, polarization isn't just about ideological extremes or the kinds of platforms or programs, policies you want to follow. It's also about whether or not different rulers and parties adhere to democratic rules of the game, or whether they're trying to manipulate the institutions so that what are supposed to be democratic checks and balances instead become instruments of an autocratic project. And so you get polarization around the institutional rules where democracy as a way of resolving conflicts begins to break down. So there's a very intense polarization around institutional rules and norms, and what is often called affective polarization, a strong dislike of the other side or a belief that they are some sort of existential threat, even if the ideological positions are not as dramatically far apart as they were in the past. Let me just circle back quickly to your other question in terms of the United States, and what are the differences in the Democratic Party, whether or not you could ever get that kind of autocratic left emerging like we've seen in parts of Latin America. I think it's hard to see that taking place. If you look at a case like Venezuela, where Hugo Chavez didn't emerge within a mainstream political party and take it over. He emerged in a context of crisis where the old order basically crumbled, and he challenged the entire political establishment and then filled the political vacuum in a rather autocratic way with his own movement. I think we're a long way away from that kind of crisis in the United States. I think what you see much more in the United States on the left is sort of a debate between more moderate social democratic lefts who want to bring about change within the system, and then a more libertarian kind of left, similar, much more along the lines of what you see in Chile with Gabriel Boric in recent times, the new leader, which is a very different kind of left in Latin America than what Hugo Chavez represents. And so I see the more radical left, if you want to call it that, in the United States, much closer to the European Greens, or what are often called the left libertarian parties in Europe, which tend to be pushing for a deeper process of democratization rather than some process of autocratic movement.
So one thing that really is distinctive about the US, not entirely, but is especially notable when you analyze American politics, is race and the challenge to establish a multiracial democracy or multi-ethnic democracy, right? So Hakeem Jefferson, who's a political scientist at Stanford, has this great saying that race is the central organizing principle of American politics. And that really is true historically, right? Nothing has defined the sort of big picture of what has happened from the Civil War to the changes to the party system after the Civil Rights Movement than conflict over race. And it seems that we're seeing, our politics are more and more consumed by conversations about race, by affective polarization surrounding the division of basically white Christians into the Republican Party and the majorities of most other ethnic groups in the Democratic Party. So it's really raised the salience of race. Though interestingly, we saw in the 2020 election returns a decline in racial polarization, which is shocking to a lot of observers given the way that Trump conducted himself in the presidency and during the campaign and in the backdrop of the Black Lives Matter movement. So the question I have is for all three of you really is, what lessons can we draw from comparative cases? I think India and Brazil are particularly useful ones here, but there are plenty of others, of large countries trying to deal with democracy in a multi-ethnic context. And to what extent is the American experience exceptional here? And to what extent does it complicate the ability to reverse democratic backsliding down the line?
Well, I would say, first, our research on polarized countries around the world has shown that those that are polarized around a formative rift reach the most entrenched and pernicious aspects and consequences of polarization. And what I mean by formative rift is a historic debate that is unresolved from the nation's founding that usually has to do with national identity or citizenship. Who is a rightful citizen? And for the United States, race, gender, and to some extent religion were those formative rifts in terms of who is a rightful citizen, and religion in terms of national identity. So obviously race has continued, and we've seen throughout history, we've gone in cycles. Every time we make progress, there is a backlash. And so we've seen that over the last couple of years as well. We've seen it repeatedly throughout history. And Rob and Suzanne's book, The Four Threats, discusses that as well. So it is a crucial thing. So the United States is one of the largest and and the most advanced, actually, most established multiracial democracies. But you mentioned Brazil, India are two excellent examples as well of multiracial democracies. And India, the problem is they did manage it for quite a while, but now it is polarizing again around religious issues that also had to do with ethnicity. And so we're seeing this polarization coming around racial, so multicultural diversity. And it's becoming violent and threatening to its democracy. So it's Hindu nationalism in the governing party is hurting that. Brazil has had certainly racism throughout its history, but it is dealing with having very much a multicultural and multiracial democracy with a majority population that has declined to be, to a non-majority population, and has managed that through its having much less of a clear division on race, and it's much more of, I'd say, a range of mixed races that are recognized in Brazil.
You want us to follow up on that, Zach?
If you have something you'd like to say, then by all means.
I think these are some of the most intractable challenges that democracies face, especially in large multiracial and multinational kinds of societies. And certainly it's become deeply conflictive in the Indian case. In a lot of the issues in Brazil with the rise of Bolsonaro, I think cannot be understood in the absence of an understanding the politicization of some of the questions about national identity, the boundaries, who really belongs to the national community, who are the true representatives of the national community. And these kinds of questions are certainly part of the challenges that we see in the United States as well. And I think when you look back historically, that formative rift in American democracy that Jennifer's talking about, it is absolutely fundamental for understanding American politics and the kinds of competitive dynamics. And you look at, I would argue that sort of following some of the work of Rob Lieberman and Suzanne Mettler, that the notion of the democratic compromise that took place after the Civil War and after Reconstruction, which basically tried to depoliticize and to insulate the national democratic regime from the racial question and the racial conflicts, basically by tolerating subnational authoritarianism in the South. And that essentially removed that formative rift around race from the competition between Democrats and Republicans for the next 90 years until the 1960s, when it gets repoliticized by the civil rights movement and basically by the national democracy imposing desegregation on the South, therefore democratizing the South. But in the process, the white backlash against that, the way in which it realigned the party system, essentially projected that authoritarian current, that white ethno-nationalist authoritarian current, to the national level party system. And I think that undergirds sort of this progressive polarization we've seen taking place, to where increasingly the conflict, the inter-party conflict between Democrats and Republicans, I would argue, has increasingly turned into a regime cleavage between democracy and authoritarianism. And I think you can't understand that without understanding the way in which the racial cleavage in American politics has realigned the party system and reshaped competition within it.
And if I can link that to Europe, where obviously racial politics, although we still use it more, ethnic politics, also play a major role. European countries don't have this historical rift. I think that is important. But I think also when you look historically, it is important to understand that racial politics, racist politics, is very dynamic, right? So who we consider white today was not the same group that was considered white in the early 20th century. And I think so race obviously is a construct, is a social construct, and as a consequence is part of the political debate. Now, if you look at the way that politics is at this moment in the US, then the type of racial politics that the Republican Party has pretty much like banked its strategy currently on does not have a long-term future, simply because of the demographic changes, as well as what you see, the growing acceptance of inclusion within the US population. However, right, I would totally imagine that within 20, 50 years, the category white fully includes the Hispanic population, which would totally create different types of potential alliances and racial politics, right? And so I think we see race and racial politics often a little bit too stagnant, too rigid, but it is a politics, right? And the whole category of what are the races and who is in and who is out is part of that political game, right? And so the whites included, let's face it, they started out as WASPs, right? First, they included the Northerners, then the Catholics, like the Irish and the Italians. And so we see that in Europe the same. When I grew up, everyone who was pretty much not white Dutch, right, was not part of the in-group. At this moment, a lot of the radical right parties are actually courting non-Muslim, non-white population, because now the other is no longer the Turk or the Moroccan, the other is the Muslim, right? Which is problematic, obviously, for the Muslims, but actually has been an opening to, for example, Surinamese in the Netherlands or Antillians to a certain extent, because yes, they're Black, but they're not Muslim. And so I think we should look at it a bit more dynamic. Racial politics can change, even if it will always be there, it's there in very different ways.
Yeah, I think the point about conditional whiteness and shifting those boundaries is really important and fascinating. I mean, I'm Jewish, and my status as being white has flip-flopped and changed and been only counted in certain ways over the course of my lifetime in different ways. And I grew up, it was unquestioned, and increasingly after Trump and in the rise of modern anti-Semitism, Jewish whiteness feels much more conditional in the United States. And then, of course, there's a whole different set of dynamics in Israel, which is another backsliding democracy that has a very complicated set of internal ethnic and religious politics that we haven't even begun to talk about. And I don't think we will, or unless somebody wants to bring it up later, because we're about to have some really great questions from the audience that I'd like to turn to. And so let me start with a question from Paul Pearson, who asked, well, what do we know from comparative work about the best strategies for unwinding pernicious polarization, and how applicable are those strategies to particular circumstances in the United States? If you were advising Joe Biden to improve our prospects, what would you tell him? And Jennifer, I think this is a question for you primarily, but Ken and Cass, feel free to pitch in if you want to.
Well, the United States has some kind of unique aspects that make it difficult to apply some of the lessons from abroad. But one lesson that does come from abroad is, and it refers back to a case that you mentioned, Zach, Italy's decade of lead, that is, of violence between political left and right back in the 1970s, was basically resolved when the Communist Party on the left and the Christian Democrats on the more conservative party, the two major parties, came together to denounce the violence that was coming from both the left and the extreme left and the extreme right. So they came together and denounced the violence. So distancing a political party and political leaders distancing themselves from violence is critical. And I think we need to learn that. That is not happening today. It's not only political leaders, but it is cultural leaders, media leaders, voices. So that's one lesson. But a second has to do with our institutions. And I am a big proponent that we're going to have institutional reform, structural reform, particularly electoral reform, is the only way to resolve our issues in the United States, because we are in such a rigid binary party system, unlike any other country in the world. In fact, only 5 of 26 Western democracies have what we have as a single member district system, the way we elect our people to Congress. And 2 of those have other, aspects to it, like a form of ranked choice voting, or runoffs. So this is one of our issues. And I think that this is leading to our pernicious polarization, because there are only 2 choices and we are locked in. The polarization today is around partisanship much more than it was even 1968. We were polarized, but it wasn't the 2 parties that were so polarized. They were still able to form cross-party coalitions. We don't do that today. The parties, particularly the Republican Party, refuses to cooperate at all with the Democrats. There's no cross-party coalition to make, for the most part, in most instances. So I think if we gave more choice to our people, we could form different coalitions around different issues. That's what we do see in other countries as a possibility in other democracies. That would reduce the level of fear, that existential threat that I talked about, remove that zero-sum game aspect of our system. And it would make people feel represented. It would make people in a completely Republican state like Cass and I live in Georgia, would make Democrats and others, libertarians and others, feel like they had some voice. And the same in Democrat-led states would let Republicans. And so I'm a proponent of ranked choice voting with multi-member districts. Perhaps we'll have time to get into that, but I'll stop there.
Anyone else have additional thoughts?
Yeah, I completely agree with Jennifer on, some of the problems with our electoral system, which in theory is supposed to create more, competition around the so-called median voter and bring the more moderate forms of competition. But the way in which, given the transformation within the parties at the grassroots of the Republican Party, how it relates to questions of the primary systems and gerrymandering, which also makes it easier for the parties to essentially to move towards the polls rather than competing for the median voter. And certainly that's been the pattern within the Republican Party. And I agree that if we can't get to proportional representation, at least some sort of ranked choice voting would help to alleviate at least some of the concerns. I think the biggest problem I see is that you look at, if we're looking to the field of comparative politics to tell us how do we, is there a formula for maintaining democracy in a 2-party system where one of the 2 parties has de facto become either an insurgent force or at least a vehicle for those who are within the democratic regime? I think that's where we are today. I don't have any answers for that. I don't know how you sustain a 2-party system where one of them is acting directly against the democratic system itself. But I think at the end of the day, it requires that more autocratic current within the Republican Party be isolated and contained. And you can't do that unless the more small d democratic tendencies within the Republican Party are willing to separate the waters and to recognize certain forms of behavior as being fundamentally anti-democratic and therefore disqualifying those kinds of behavior. And the trouble we see is the moderates in the Republican Party haven't done that. They had an opportunity to do that after Trump's effort to reverse the election. And instead, they're censoring Liz Cheney and Kaczynski. So the elements within the party that actually took a democratic stand, they're the ones who are being disqualified and censored within the party, rather than those who supported the anti-democratic behavior. And so I think the Republican Party had a chance to correct course and to reassert its democratic vocation. It hasn't done that. But I think if we're going to try for Biden to try to move towards a strategy to calm the waters, it would require those elements within the Republican Party that do believe in the democratic system to try to find bridges to reach out to the Democrats to work with.
So our next question is from Veronica Reyna. It's for Cass, asking you referred to the states in the US as the main sites of backsliding today. And if backsliding is occurring through the states, what role can the federal government play to prevent it? And what would a national policy look like and which institutions could implement it?
Well, I think we have seen what it looks like, and we've seen that it failed. right? I mean, it was a Voting Rights Act, which which could have been passed at the level of Congress. And fact of the matter is that the Democrats didn't have the votes for it. And I think by now time has run out, and I don't think anything can be done anymore except of hoping that the midterms are not as disastrous as some people fear. Because after the midterms, like, Democrats will unlikely still have a majority in both houses. I mean, probably not even in any of the houses. So I'm sorry, I can't do much optimism. Maybe that is just where I live, and like the onslaught of what has come at us over the last year. But there was a moment, and that moment was a Voting Rights Act. I mean, to put it simply, states like Georgia and others had to be put like under federal watch again, and they weren't, for whatever reason, but they weren't. And obviously the Republicans are not going to support this type of law. So after the midterms, this moment is simply over. But what I think is far more important, and that is something that is always also really frustrating, is, first of all, I think state politics is studied far too little and ignored far too much in national media and academic studies, but also it is compartmentalized, which is just so unrealistic, because whatever happens in Tennessee is going to happen in Georgia just a bit later. Like, all these laws that we're seeing at the moment, like, they don't all come in the same state, but they will come through the same states. Why? Because there's a concerted effort behind it, right? And so these laws will come to the federal level. And that is something that people should really start working on, like, rather than just thinking that, oh, that is Georgia, that is the South, right? No, this is not Georgia. This is not the South. This is the national concerted effort to undermine democracy. And these type of laws will come in other states and will come at the federal. What do you do? Like, how do you fight them? And let's not forget that there are a lot of people who support them, right? I mean, a lot of, this is the 90% that Jennifer talked about, which personally I think is the most frightening thing that I've heard at this, like, in this talk, right? But we all the time, we understand that Democrats look at the Republicans and think like, whoa, that's a threat to democracy. And it's valid, I think so too. However, my neighbor, like, looks at the Democratic Party and thinks exactly the same, right? And much of what we're talking about changing electoral systems or teaching tolerance or whatever, that's all fun and games if you're in California or New York, but it's not going to pass. Like, it's not going to pass in Georgia at this moment. And after 2022, it's not going to pass at the federal level.
Could I add on to that?
Please.
Because I actually share Cass's pessimism in many ways. And I think our problem is two. One is we look, it's often theoretically, people who defend US resilience, democratic resilience, say one of our strengths is our federal system. So we have the states, we're decentralized, nothing's gonna, add up. We can't have a conspiracy throughout all 50 states, et cetera. But what we've seen is that everything, campaign finance, media, the political parties, the messaging, everything has been nationalized. And so this effort that Cass was talking about, there are model legislative packages spread around the states on the same thing. And it's in addition to voting rights, it's reproductive rights. It is now the ability to teach in the schools and in the universities, history and racial history in particular. So academic freedom and the right to teach. So it's across the board. What I want to say though is that I think this can't be fixed in Washington. Washington is broken. We can't rely on the political parties, the national level, to fix this. It's going to take a social movement. And we learn this from other countries as well, that it really requires civil society. That is business, tech billionaires, business corporations, labor movements, academia, foundations, grassroots organizations, students. It is going to take a social movement to understand the threat to democracy for all of us and to push for these reforms. It's going to start it's starting at the local levels. Cities, for example, are doing ranked choice voting, et cetera. Some states, those kinds of things can slowly trickle up, but I think it's going to take a much more concerted effort to organize, and it's going to take all these sectors of society, because it's not going to happen in Washington.
So I'm going to use my moderator prerogative now, both to recommend two political science books that I think are really useful and interesting on this question of how states became national actors and reshaping democracy. Alex Hurdle Fernandez's State Capture, which is about the American Legislative Exchange Commission, which has helped spread a lot of this model legislation. It's, I think, a great book, as is Jake Grumbach's forthcoming Laboratories Against Democracy, a sort of the cutting edge look at the way that states have become the epicenter of democratic backsliding in the United States. So those are both good, but they actually aren't the question that I wanted to ask. The question that I want to ask, and again, sorry audience, but I'm very curious about this, is that when we talk about a movement or democratic rebirth or civil society organizing around this, there's a lot of talk in the wake of the Ukraine crisis that the democratic world is finally waking up to the threat that has come both from without and within. And that this might be, a galvanizing point, not only for maybe some moderates in the Republican Party to be more aggressive, but for people who are in the business sector or activists or philanthropists who have the money to fund pro-democracy activism to say, hey, wait a minute, we got to do something about this. Is it conceivable? Is there precedent historically for international events to have this kind of domestic galvanizing effect in the US? The closest thing I can think of is the way that the Cold War and Cold War competition shaped the federal response to the civil rights movement. But even that is, I think, a very different historical case than what we'd be talking about right here. It's very different mechanisms.
Well, after World War, sorry, Ken, go ahead. You were going to.
Go ahead, Jen.
All right. I would say after World War II, there was obviously, the Marshall Plan and the whole, effort to democratize Western Europe and Japan, and it was built on, I think in Western Europe, much more of a class compromise. It was labor and business coming together with government's help to really build a social welfare state that was still capitalist and where everyone could progress. And we don't see that now today. We have a very different situation, particularly in the United States, with the weakness of labor unions and growing economic inequality. But in terms of what Ukraine is going to do for galvanizing, the one thing I do worry about is what's being talked about is kind of a new Cold War between democracies versus autocracies. And I worry about that for a couple of reasons. One is that the existential threats that the planet faces today as a globe, pandemics, climate change, access to water, nuclear weapons, actually requires cooperation among all kinds of countries, not just democracies. Democracies alone can't solve it. So I'm a little worried about, kind of a Cold War, and also pushing countries that are feeling in the middle, or particularly, those surrounding Russia, pushing them to choose, us versus them, could actually endanger them. So I'm a little worried about that. And even though we have galvanized democracies, Western democracies in this fight, and including some others, a few, Latin America and stuff, Africa is very cautious about the response. Other countries, Middle East, others are cautious. And in fact, in the UN resolution, one thing I read was that the countries that abstained from condemning Russia represent 51% of the world's population. So half of the world's population, is not condemning Russia.
And that is in part because it was India and China, right? And you always have to be careful with that counting. But I'm actually very skeptical, as probably always. But let's face it, so far, what has the Ukraine war done It has sustained Boris Johnson's career. He was pretty much gone, but now everyone rallies around the flag. It has pretty much absolved Poland of like everything it's done before. It's now the model state because it takes in so many Ukrainian refugees, and we don't talk anymore about the fact that obviously they had a very racist campaign versus Syrian refugees, or about the fact that they were actually on the hot chair for their illiberal democratic regime. The EU and NATO are not going to push Turkey and Hungary at the moment very hard because they need them on board, right? And so that's one of the dangers of this Cold War. Like, as I said before, during the Cold War, we worked with Pinochet, we worked with Franco. Like, when you get into this kind of strong mentality of just frontier thinking, good and bad, then everyone takes a position and it doesn't matter that much what for the rest you do. And so first of all, I think there's one important thing that will, I think, come out of Ukraine, and that's a very different thinking within Europe about defense. This was already kind of a consequence of Trump, and particularly by questioning the Article 5, I think it is, of NATO, coming to the aid of every NATO state. That led to an open thinking of, for example, the German Minister of Defense about starting to build a European defense. This Ukraine clearly has made defense a more important issue. I think the trauma of having a potential next Republican who will again not really come to the aid. I think Europeans understand more and more that NATO depends on a democratic president for the moment. And so we're going to build a European army one way or another. The sad thing about that is it just comes after Brexit. And of course, Britain was one of the only two countries together with France who had a sizable army. So for the Europeans now to build their own military capacity that is not fully dependent upon the US is an even more massive challenge than it was before Brexit. But the thinking is there, and this can have important consequences, I think, for transatlantic relations.
So I want to combine two of the questions, one anonymous and the other from Josh Simon, which basically the question here is the role that inequality plays in polarization and democratic backsliding. So I want to quote from Josh Simon's question, where he says, "It strikes me that the populist movement that draws support from marginally and informally employed sectors of the economy dominated by primary goods export, like Venezuela, is likely to be significantly different from a populist movement that draws support from a more and more precariously employed sectors of a post-industrial economy like the US. Does this limit the utility of a case like Venezuela as a model for potential future developments in the USA?" And then also, in addition to that specific comparison, more broadly, I'm curious about the panelists' thought about the relationship between globalization, rising economic inequality, and the rise of anti-democratic movements. But I guess maybe we can start with Ken talking about the Venezuela comparison.
Yeah, I think there's certainly some truth that the kinds of social bases that are mobilized behind a left-wing populism like we saw in Venezuela is quite different from what you see mobilizing behind right-wing, more nationalistic populisms in the United States or Western Europe or the Brazilian case. And so I think it's very common that populism will draw from popular constituencies working in lower classes, but not exclusively so. I mean, populism almost always has a multi-class base. And very often populist leaders are tapping into economic discontents in one form or another, but there's no particular economic model or set of policies that defines populism. I would argue that populism is really defined in the political sphere, and it's very malleable in terms of how it maps onto different kinds of economic interests or certain kinds of economic policies. And so my sense is that populism tends to play off of economic grievances and discontents, and certainly inequalities can be part of that. But I think the concrete ways in which different economic formations map onto populist politics. It varies considerably from one place to another. But I do think that there is something about the way in which globalization has both undermined state sovereignty in the international community, and the extent to which globalization ended up occurring. It was a globalization that was heavily driven by market processes, intended to narrow the ability of national states to be socially integrative, to reduce inequalities, and to politically and economically incorporate mass constituencies the way in which they had done historically. There's a version of that story in Europe, there's a version in the United States, and a version in Latin America. And so I think very oftentimes you see populist figures mobilizing around nationalist planks that challenge globalization, challenge international institutions as well as global markets, and then also appeal to the discontents of their own constituencies, which have been left behind in processes of this market globalization. So again, that story plays out in quite different ways in different places, but I think it's part of the sort of the populist zeitgeist that Cass has talked about in some of his work.
Can I add one thing about kind of the transnational nature of some of these movements, which I think is important, and also the comparison that Ken drew, I think is absolutely right. But I want to make a point about, I do like Hacker and Pearson's book, Let Them Eat Tweets, which basically argues that the United States populism is a plutocratic populism. And Cass could tell us how many other populist countries are like this, but with the plutocrats, that is the wealthy, kind of distracting and retaining working class support for the economic policies that basically benefit the wealthy by distracting them with cultural issues and cultural identity issues. This makes perfect sense to me for what is happening in the United States, but also in some other countries. But what I want to say about the transnational connections here across levels of development, across different types of economies, is striking, particularly on the conservative, the right-wing populist side. And that is an example. Next week in Hungary is coming sort of an international version of CPAC. That is the Conservative Political Action Committee from the United States that just met, a couple of weeks ago in the United States. There's a meeting here that will include American conservatives, but also Eduardo Bolsonaro, the son of Jair Bolsonaro, the head of Brazil, is coming. And of course, Orban will be a featured speaker and others. So there's this kind of transnational sharing of ideas, I would say, that's important. And of course, we saw that in the trucker strike in Canada, with a lot of the support coming from the United States and then moving to other countries, France, Australia. So I think that this is an important thing to look at too.
They actually just rescheduled that to May, the CPAC in Budapest, because I think the war is the reason why. I was planning on going. That's part of why I know that. So before we go, we only have a few more minutes left. I want to turn to a question from Bob Albrecht, where he asks, to what extent has the Chinese model of a closed political system combined with a semi-open economic system impacted the deterioration of democracy in nations where China has established some form of footprint? In other words, is China throwing its weight around as an autocratic enabler, sort of doing the inverse of or maybe the evil twin of American soft democracy promotion and doing autocracy promotion in ways that are encouraging democratic backsliding in otherwise democratic states?
I think this is actually a very interesting point, because whenever I read IR articles about foreign influence and the effect of foreign direct investment, there's still this assumption that this money comes predominantly from liberal democracies, which will require certain rule of law and some type of liberal democratic things. Now, leaving aside, of course, liberal democratic countries were never that interested in it, this is simply not the reality anymore. right? And if you look at a few years ago, like the US, China, Russia, Brazil, India, none of them had a leader that was particularly interested in liberal democracy. And so this is a fundamental difference with particularly the 90s, I would say, and the early 2000s, that there is no, this liberal democratic consensus, however hypocritical it was, right, is simply not a reality for many countries anymore. And this is, of course, particularly the case for Africa, where China is a major player, as well as Russia. But this is also the case in various European countries. Obviously, Orban felt strengthened by the fact that Trump had won the election, right? And why does he have these ties with China and with Russia? Because China and Russia don't care that his state is completely corrupt, right? They will just pay the money, and that's much easier than with others. And so I think that this is something that we don't take fully into account yet, that it's not that China and Russia try to create mini Chinas and mini Russias. They don't, right? They just don't care about whether you are corrupt or not corrupt, or whether you are democratic or not. And so the international pressure on regimes to be democratic, to be liberal, is very weak. And to all my shame, as I'm a very critical resident of the US, it comes down to the US. The EU has always been weak. Just look at Hungary, right? And yes, I'm also one of those lefties who have always been very critical about how hypocritical the US has been in pressuring countries. But let's face it, we learned during the Trump presidency what happens if we don't even have that hypocritical pressure anymore, right? And so I think that is incredibly important.
Either of the other two panelists have closing thoughts on this or any other issues you want to raise?
I also want to just reiterate the point. My sense is that the global winds have shifted considerably in recent years. Now, with the war in Ukraine, we're in a different ballgame now than we were a month ago with respect to this. But certainly the kinds of liberal democratic political winds that were blowing in the 1980s, early 1990s, that those winds have shifted in another direction. There's coordination across autocratic actors in the global arena, and certainly the United States itself was not the strong voice that it had been. And so I think we need to be aware of this, that there is an international dimension to these processes of democratic backsliding. It's easy to talk about the domestic dynamics, what it means for institutions, what it means for civil society, but it's important to keep the larger international, that level of analysis is important for what we have to understand.
I just want to agree that it's really critical, I think, for us to remember this in the United States, that we've got to come together because the world order is changing and we're going to be addressing questions. Food security is a major thing disrupted by this war, and our economic interdependence, all the assumptions that economic interdependence would lead to peace, have been upended, and all of the digital space, the technological space, everything that is being upended, we're going to be having to come up with completely new institutions and rules, I think, as a result of this. And so if we don't have our own democracy together in the United States as one of the critical players in this world, then we're going to be in trouble.
Thanks, everybody. That is a suitably depressing note to end our conversation on. Rob, I don't know if you want to say anything before we all go, but thanks on behalf of the panel, I guess. Thanks for having us all for this conversation.
Well, I just want to end by thanking you, Zach, and all the panelists for a really terrific discussion, if it wasn't exactly uplifting. But if you're looking for uplift, the next and final installment in our series is called Frontiers of Democratic Reform. That'll be on Wednesday, April 20th at 1 p.m. Eastern. So look out for that. The panelists there will be Lee Drutman, my colleague here at Johns Hopkins, Hari Hahn, Larry Jacobs, and Judd Choate, and will be moderated by Jelani Cobb of The New Yorker. So be sure and join us for that. Thanks again to Zach and the panelists, and I wish everyone a great afternoon.